This video covers Word2Vec, a simple and popular word embedding technique. I'll talk about computing probabilities for Word2Vec, defining input vectors, and learning the embeddings themselves. I'll also discuss the overall architecture of a Word2Vec model, along with weight optimization in Word2Vec, and finally the training data used to create the model. In the written materials for this course, we already discussed some of the basic intuition underlying Word2Vec. At a high level, the algorithm represents all words in a vocabulary as a vector, treating the target word W and a neighboring context word C as positive samples. It then randomly samples other words in the lexicon to get negative samples, finds the similarity for each target context word pair, and uses this to calculate probabilities regarding whether the context word does or does not occur in the context of the target word. The algorithm then trains a classifier to maximize these probabilities such that it is able to distinguish between positive and negative cases, and then uses the weights from that classifier as the word embeddings. We'll go over these components in more detail in the following slides. First, we need to figure out how to actually compute the probability that a context word does or does not occur in the context of the target word. Word2Vec bases this probability on vector similarity. So remember from cosine similarity that vector similarity is proportional to the dot product between two vectors. A dot product doesn't provide us with a probability though, which is what we ultimately need. Word2Vec solves this problem by applying the sigmoid function, just like we saw with logistic regression, to the dot product between the target and context word vectors, resulting in a probability ranging from 0 to 1. Since Word2Vec is performing a binary classification here, the context word either is or isn't really in the context of the target word, we can also get the negative probability just like we did with binary logistic regression by subtracting 1 minus the positive probability that we computed. These probabilities so far sort of assume that the model is looking at words in isolation, although really it's not. Words generally occur in strings of text, like what you see here. Word2Vec makes a very big simplifying assumption that all context words are independent of one another. We know very well that that's not true. Words in language often depend quite heavily on the presence of those around them, but this heuristic still provides reasonable performance with Word2Vec. Since we're assuming that all context words are independent then, the algorithm just goes ahead and multiplies their probabilities together to determine the probability of a span of text occurring in the context of the target word. This means then that we have all the ingredients we need to determine a probability based on how similar a context window is to the target word, and you can see that in action here. Ultimately, we're just taking the dot product of the target word with each context word C, and then taking the sigmoid of each of those dot products, and then taking the product of all of those sigmoids. So it's that simple. Now we know how to compute our probabilities. We still have a few unanswered questions, though, before we can implement our own Word2Vec model. For starters, we saw early on that a Word2Vec model actually accepts some kind of vector as input. How are these representations defined? On top of that, our entire goal of this process is to learn new word embeddings that represent the words in our lexicon. We've seen how to compute probabilities, but a probability isn't a representation. How are we actually learning our word embeddings using this algorithm? The first question is very easy to answer. In Word2Vec, input words are typically just represented as one-hot vectors using a binary bag of words approach. There's a dimension in the input vector for every single word in the vocabulary, and there's a 1 in the dimension corresponding to the input word. For every other dimension, there's a 0. The second question is a bit more challenging. The word embeddings produced by Word2Vec are the weights learned for a classification model that learns to predict the probabilities of context words belonging with target words. So we start out with our input, encode the input as a one-hot vector, and feed that one-hot vector into a layer of in units, where in is whatever dimensionality we want our word embedding to be. Each one of those units computes a weighted sum of the input values. The outputs from each of those units are fed into a final unit, which also computes a weighted sum of inputs and then makes a prediction based on that weighted sum. The prediction corresponds to the likelihood of a context word C occurring with the input target word. There are enough of those final units to cover all possible context words. So now we have a classifier that can predict whether different context words will occur with a target word. However, that's not the part that we care about. What we actually care about is that middle layer, where each unit is applying different sets of weights to the same values from the one-hot encoded input vector. That means that for a given dimension in the input vector, which means for a specific word in the vocabulary, since this is a bag of words input vector, there will be a set of n different weights from the middle layer, with each dimension in this n-dimensional weight vector corresponding to a different unit. So for the input word super in this example, we might have a vector of weights 0.1, 0.7, all the way to 0.8 for unit n. These are the weights we're interested in and are the actual embeddings learned by Word2Vec. And now that we've seen how the embeddings are learned, the next logical question might be, how are these weights from the middle layer of the Word2Vec model optimized? And the answer is that this is an iterative process that works very similarly to how weights are optimized in logistic regression. The weights are initialized to some random value for each word, and then over time they're updated so that they produce more accurate output probabilities. Since the weights are randomly initialized, they're almost certain to be wrong for the classifier's first prediction. However, just like with logistic regression, we can make use of the error values from our incorrect guesses to update our weights in hopes of making better predictions the next time. So now the only thing missing from our understanding of Word2Vec is figuring out where the training data comes from. A really nice benefit of Word2Vec is that it doesn't require a traditional labeled corpus. Instead, you just take a big collection of text and assume that all occurrences of words and their corresponding contexts are positive samples. Of course, we still need negative samples as well, so then we create our own negative samples to supplement the positive training samples. The way we create them is to just randomly sample context words from the training set. We sample these words according to their distribution in the training set, weighted by a parameter alpha. And generally, this alpha value is set to 0.75, so rarer words are slightly more likely to be selected than would be expected just from their relative frequency in the data set. Word2Vec typically takes more negative samples than positive samples during the training process, so we randomly select a bunch of negative samples, add them to our collection of positive samples, and now we finally have all the pieces of our puzzle needed to build a Word2Vec model.